Hello?
Oh, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hello?
Is this Mrs. Dorothy Letterman?
That's right, Dorothy.
Yes, it is. Who's this?
Are you the mother of David Letterman who does Late Night on NBC?
People who had spent years building careers, who had genuinely believed they had a real relationship with Carson, found themselves suddenly and permanently on the outside without a single explanation. They replayed conversations in their heads, reviewed their appearances, tried to identify the moment things had shifted. Often, they could never pinpoint it. The most instructive stories are not necessarily the most dramatic ones. The most dramatic fallout, the one between Carson and Joan Rivers, has been told and retold over the years, and for good reason. Rivers had been one of Carson's most celebrated protégés, a comedian he had championed publicly and trusted implicitly, and the rupture between them when she accepted a competing hosting deal without telling him first became one of the defining feuds in television history. The pain on both sides was real, the silence lasted until Carson's death, and the story illustrated everything about how Carson processed loyalty and betrayal. But there were other stories, quieter and less examined, that revealed just as much. There were performers who had done nothing more provocative than speak an uncomfortable truth on a stage that was not built for uncomfortable truths. There were artists who had taken up too much space, who had overshadowed the host in some subtle way that the audience never noticed but Carson felt immediately. There were people who simply reminded him of something he did not want to think about, and so they disappeared from his rotation without ceremony. What united all of these cases was the asymmetry of the relationship. Carson held all of the power, and his guests, no matter how famous, no matter how talented, held almost none. The moment you stepped onto his stage, you were in his world, operating by his rules, succeeding or failing based on his judgment. That dynamic extended well beyond the broadcast itself. His influence reached into every corner of the industry, into the offices of bookers and executives and producers who all understood, without being told, that crossing Johnny Carson was not something you did and survived professionally. It is worth pausing here to separate the mythology from the reality of the man himself. Johnny Carson was, without question, one of the most skilled television performers who ever lived. His timing was extraordinary, the product of decades of disciplined craft, not accident. He had a genuine gift for making people feel comfortable, for drawing out the best in his guests and presenting it to the widest possible audience. He launched more careers than any single figure in television history, and the late-night format that every host since has used is essentially the blueprint he perfected over 30 years. He was also, by most accounts, a deeply private and emotionally guarded man who struggled throughout his life with intimacy and connection. He married 4 times. His relationship with his children was complicated by his fame and his emotional distance. When he retired in 1992, he withdrew so completely from public life that many people in the industry rarely heard from him again. He moved to Malibu, spent time on his boat, and turned down virtually every interview request until his death in 2005 from emphysema. The man who had spent 3 decades being watched by millions chose to spend his final years being seen by almost no one. These two things, the brilliance and the coldness, were not separate. They were the same thing, expressed in different directions. The discipline that made him a great performer was the same discipline that made him capable of cutting people off completely and never looking back. The control he maintained over his stage was the same control he maintained over his personal world. He was not a villain, but he was not merely a genial entertainer either. He was something more complicated, a man of genuine gifts and genuine limitations, who happened to occupy a position of extraordinary power at the exact moment when that power could shape careers and lives in ways that no single person should probably ever be able to do. The women and men who found themselves banned from The Tonight Show went on to live very different lives afterward. Some rebuilt their careers through sheer persistence, finding other stages and other audiences and eventually earning their place back in the public conversation through routes that bypassed Carson entirely. Some never fully recovered, not because they lacked talent, but because the Carson exile had happened at the precise moment when their momentum was greatest, and the interruption proved impossible to overcome. Some carried the wound privately, talking about it in interviews years later with voices that still held traces of hurt. And some came to a kind of peace with it, understanding that the power Carson had over their careers was never truly about them at all. It was about him, his needs, his fears, his particular and demanding vision of how the world around him should operate. Being excluded from that world was painful. But it did not mean you had failed. It meant, in many cases, that you had simply been yourself in a space that required you to be something else. That is the real story behind the silences and the missing names and the empty guest chairs. It was never simply about who was talented enough or professional enough or funny enough. It was about who could navigate the unspoken rules of one man's kingdom, and what happened to everyone who could not. The curtain fell for Johnny Carson in January 2005. The laughter he generated still echoes. And somewhere in that echo, if you listen closely, you can still hear the names of the people who were never allowed back in. There is a version of Hollywood history that never makes it into the highlight reels. It does not live in the blooper clips or the anniversary specials. It exists in the silences, in the names that slowly stopped being called, in the phone lines that went cold, and in the guest chairs that stayed empty for years without a single public explanation. And at the center of that silence, for nearly 30 years, sat one man, Johnny Carson. To the average American household, Johnny Carson was as familiar as the living room couch itself. Every weeknight, from 1962 to 1992, he was there, cool, composed, and radiating that effortless Midwestern charm that made you feel like the most important person in the room, even when you were just watching from your sofa in Ohio. He was the undisputed king of late-night television, and his show, The Tonight Show, was the most powerful stage in the entertainment industry. A 5-minute appearance on that stage could change a comedian's entire trajectory. One approving nod from Johnny, one wave of his hand inviting a nervous newcomer to the guest chair, and careers were made overnight. But here is what the cameras never fully captured. The same hand that waved you in could just as easily wave you out forever. And when Johnny Carson decided you were done, you were done. Not just with his show, with the industry. Because in those decades, Johnny Carson was not merely a television host. He was a gatekeeper. And the gates he controlled were the only ones that mattered. The power of The Tonight Show during the Carson era is genuinely difficult to explain to anyone who grew up in the age of streaming and social media. Today, if a comedian bombs on one platform, they pivot to another. Audiences are fragmented, attention is distributed, and there are dozens of ways to reach millions of people. But in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, the media landscape was narrow. There were 3 major networks and a handful of late-night time slots. Getting booked on Carson's show was not just good press, it was practically the entire path to national stardom. Stand-up comedians who performed well on The Tonight Show would walk off that stage with their phones ringing for weeks. Actors who sat down for a casual interview and made Johnny laugh found their box office numbers climbing. Musicians who performed on that stage sold records. The show had an audience in the tens of millions on any given night, and Carson had their trust completely. When he liked someone, America liked them. And when he stopped liking someone, America somehow forgot they had ever existed. That last part was never announced. There were no press releases, no public statements, no dramatic confrontations played out on air. Carson's disapproval operated entirely in the shadows. Bookings simply stopped coming. Calls went unreturned. Industry executives, who depended on their own relationships with Carson and his producers, quietly started keeping their distance from anyone who had fallen out of favor. The entertainment business runs on relationships and proximity to power, and nobody in Hollywood wanted to be caught standing next to someone Johnny Carson had already walked away from. What could land a performer on the wrong side of Johnny Carson? The list is longer and stranger than most people realize. Some acts were banished for practical reasons, a guest who took up too much time, a comedian who stepped on the host's punchlines one too many times, a performer who brought an uncleared prop on stage and disrupted the rhythm of the show. Carson was famously meticulous about control. The show moved at his pace, followed his energy, and existed to showcase his reactions as much as his guests' performances. Anyone who threatened that delicate balance was a liability. Other bands came from something deeper, a perceived betrayal of loyalty. Carson ran his world like a quiet monarchy. You were either with him or you were not, and there was no negotiation once the verdict was delivered. He expected the people he had championed and elevated to remain in his orbit, grateful and deferential. When they moved in directions he had not approved, signing deals without his blessing, speaking publicly about things he considered off-limits, accepting opportunities from rivals, he experienced it as a personal affront. And personal affronts in Carson's world were never forgiven. They were simply absorbed into the silence. Then there were the bands that stemmed from on-air moments gone wrong. A joke that cut too close, a comment that landed badly, an energy that clashed with the show's carefully maintained atmosphere. Carson was gifted at projecting warmth on television, but anyone who spent real time around him knew that the warmth had clear boundaries. Cross those boundaries, even accidentally, and you would feel the temperature drop behind the smile. He would keep smiling for the cameras. But the invitation would not come again. What made the whole system so effective, and so brutal, was how invisible it was. Hollywood has always had its share of public feuds and dramatic fallouts, the kind that make headlines and generate tabloid ink for months. Carson's method of exclusion was nothing like that. It was quiet, clean, and nearly impossible to fight against because it was never officially declared. How do you dispute a ban that was never announced? How do you appeal a decision that was never spoken aloud? You cannot write a letter demanding to know why your bookings stopped. You cannot hold a press conference to defend yourself against a charge that was never formally made. You are simply no longer there, and after a while, people stop noticing the absence. This is what made the Carson exile so psychologically devastating for the people who experienced it. It was not just the professional damage, though that was real and significant. It was the uncertainty, the lack of closure, the gnawing question of what exactly had happened and whether there was anything that could be done to fix it.